Payback Times.
After 15 years writing the shareholder agreements that protected other people's money, I had finally started trusting that someone else had written one to protect mine. That was my first mistake. I was 3 pages into the Valora software quarterly operating expenses when I stopped. My hands went still on the spreadsheet, and for a moment the only sound in my home office was the faint hiss of the jasmine candle burning down to nothing on my desk. The executive compensation line item had jumped, not crept upward, not nudged into new territory. Jumped. $34,000 in the third quarter of last year. $149,000 in the third quarter of this year. 340%. I rounded down to be generous. I set the report on the desk and looked at it the way you look at something that has just said something alarming in a quiet room. It was past 10 on a Tuesday night, and the rest of my house was quiet in the way that only happens when you live alone and have stopped apologizing for it. The rest of my quarterly portfolio review had gone smoothly. 6 of my 7 active investments were boring in the best possible way. Revenue tracking as expected. Churn rates stable. Customer acquisition costs reasonable. I had saved Valoris for last, the way you save something complicated for when you're still sharp enough to taste what's in it. Executive compensation for a company at Valoris's stage meant, in practical terms, one person. Declan Hartwell, founder, CEO, and the man holding 61% of the company's equity like a hand of cards he had never had to. I reached for the board meeting minutes next, the quarterly package that was supposed to accompany the financials. I had 28% of this company. I was entitled to these documents. I had read every one of them over the 18 months since I had wired $850,000 into Declan's vision with a sense of professional confidence I now recognized as something uncomfortably close to vanity. There was no board resolution approving a compensation increase. There was no vote recorded. There was no notation in the minutes of any discussion of executive pay at any meeting in the past 4 quarters. What there was, buried in a footnote on page 7 of the Q3 narrative, was a single line. CEO compensation adjusted per performance milestone framework as established in the executive employment agreement. I read it twice. Then I pulled off my reading glasses and pressed my fingers against my closed eyes. I knew what that sentence was. I had written sentences exactly like it years ago for clients who needed plausible language to dress up decisions that had not been made properly. I had also, more often, flagged sentences exactly like it when reviewing agreements on the other side. It was the kind of language that sounded procedural and official until you asked the obvious question, who approved the performance milestone framework and when? I opened the bottom drawer and took out the Valora shareholder agreement. 74 pages, spiral bound, with my signature in blue ink on the last page next to Declan's confident scrawl. I had read every word of this document before I signed it. I had read it the way I used to read agreements for clients at Morrison Stahl, not skimming for headline terms, but parsing the structure, following the cross-references, checking what each defined term actually defined. I was proud of that. I was, if I am being honest, a little smug about it. I began reading again. And here is the thing about reading a contract with fresh suspicion. It becomes an entirely different document. The language you accepted as standard boilerplate 18 months ago starts to look like a series of choices someone made deliberately. Every absence becomes as loud as what is present. I was looking for the cumulative voting provision. I found the voting section on page 31. I read it slowly, the way you read something when you already know what you are going to find and you are just confirming it. The agreement established a 3-member board of directors. Shareholders voted for board seats in proportion to their equity holdings. Standard straight voting. It was not there. The cumulative voting provision was not there. I sat back in my chair and stared at the page. I had written that clause into agreements 100 times, maybe more. It was one of the first things I put on my checklist when drafting for a minority investor client, right up there with anti-dilution protections and information rights. The mechanics of it are elegant in a quietly powerful way. Instead of casting your votes proportionally across all board seats, cumulative voting lets a minority shareholder concentrate all their votes on a single seat. Multiply your shares by the number of board seats being elected, apply them all to one candidate, and suddenly a 28% holder has a genuine shot at getting their person into the room. Without it, the math was brutally simple. Declan had 61%. I had 28. The remaining 11% was distributed among a small handful of early employees and advisors who, as far as I could tell, had never contradicted Declan on anything in their professional lives. Every board vote was a foregone conclusion. The 3 seats were his 3 seats. I was watching from outside a window, pressing my face to the glass. I thought about the negotiation. 18 months ago, a lifetime ago, sitting across from Declan's attorney in that glass-walled conference room while rain tapped against the windows. Declan had offered me a higher valuation than I had asked for, enough higher that it felt like a concession, a gesture of good faith. His attorney had been smooth and collegial, the kind of corporate lawyer who makes you feel like you are all on the same team. And somewhere in the back and forth of a long negotiation day, the cumulative voting clause had slipped off the table. I did not even remember it happening. I remembered thinking the valuation bump offset it. I remembered telling myself I would work with Declan directly, that this was a relationship investment, that the formal voting mechanics mattered less when you had genuine alignment. I had written that clause into agreements for clients who never even knew why it mattered. I had forgotten to fight for it for myself. I set the agreement down and pressed my palms flat on the desk. My hands were steady. That surprised me a little. When things had gone sideways in the past, the anger came first and the strategy came after. Tonight it seemed to be happening in reverse. The anger was there, but it was cold and specific, like water in January. Underneath it, already running, was the part of my brain that had spent 15 years in conference rooms with people who were trying to take things that did not belong to them. I picked up my phone and called Janelle. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she was still awake, probably in her own version of this scene. Janelle Achebe had been my study partner in law school and was now a partner at a firm that specialized in business litigation. We had the kind of friendship that required no preamble at odd hours. "It is late," she said, which was her version of hello. "I know. I am looking at something in a shareholder agreement. Yours or someone else's?" "Mine." Brief pause. "How bad?" "I do not know yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe the CEO of a company I put $850,000 into just unilaterally gave himself a 340% compensation increase with no board approval, and I am sitting here with a voting structure that gives me no practical mechanism to do anything about it." The pause this time was longer. "Send me the financials and the agreement tonight. Do not contact the CEO. Do not send anything in writing to anyone at the company." "I know. I know you know. I am saying it anyway." I could hear her moving, the sound of a chair, papers shifting. "Come in at 8. We will use the small conference room." "Janelle, I do not even know if there is actually a problem yet." "Then we will figure out what the actual problem is." "At 8, try to sleep." I put the phone down and almost laughed. Try to sleep. As though sleep were a thing that happened to people who had just discovered they might be watching their investment get quietly hollowed out from the inside. I opened my laptop. I created a new encrypted folder in the secure vault I use for sensitive portfolio documents. I named it Portfolio Review, innocuous enough to be invisible to anyone who glanced at my file structure. Specific enough in context to be exactly what it was, the beginning of a record. I scanned the Q3 financials, all 11 pages. I photographed each page of the relevant board minutes section with my phone, then transferred the files. I scanned the relevant pages of the shareholder agreement, the voting section, the compensation provisions, the definition section, the notice requirements. I created a single document, a plain text memo to myself with no header and no addressee, and I typed 4 lines. Q3 executive compensation, 340% increase. No board resolution on file. No shareholder notification provided. Voting structure, straight voting only. No cumulative provision. I saved it into the folder, encrypted everything, and closed the laptop. Then I let myself sit in the quiet for a moment and think about Declan. I had met him at the Meridian Innovation Summit, which was the kind of event I normally attended, with low expectations and good shoes. The kind of room where half the pitches were solutions looking for problems, and the other half were interesting ideas presented by people who had no idea how to execute them. Declan had been different. He had presented Valoris's core product with a kind of specificity that told me he had actually talked to the customers, actually understood the operational pain he was solving. He knew his numbers. He knew his competitive landscape. He asked smart questions from the audience after other people's pitches, which told me even more. We had gotten coffee the next morning. He was funny, self-deprecating about his first failed startup, intensely focused when the conversation turned serious. He had the founder, quality I valued most, which was the ability to hold a complex problem in his head while talking about something else entirely. You could see it in his eyes, some part of him always turning the next question over. I had done 6 weeks of diligence. I had talked to customers. I had reviewed the cap table, the employment agreements, the IP assignments, the corporate structure. I had modeled the scenarios. I had negotiated the term sheet. I had done the work. And I had still ended up in a room where someone could vote me off every board seat and quietly restructure his own compensation without my knowledge or consent. And the document with my signature on it offered me surprisingly little to hold on to. That was the part that sat in my chest like a stone. Not the money, though $850,000 is not nothing. Not even the possibility that Declan was acting in bad faith. I did not know that yet. I knew one anomalous line item and an absence where a clause should have been. What sat in my chest was the familiar, specific humiliation of being the person who should have known better. I thought about the framed photograph on the shelf behind my desk. Morrison Stahl's 4 founding partners, a black and white image from 1987, the year the firm opened its doors in a 2-room office with second-hand furniture and outsized ambitions. My former boss, Marcus Morrison, was in the far left of the frame, 20 years younger and already carrying that expression, the one that said he had read the document more carefully than you had. He used to say that the best protection in any agreement was the protection you negotiated before you needed it. You cannot retrofit clauses into a signed contract, Priya. You can only use what is already there. I was going to find out what was already there. I had no intention of calling Declan. I had no intention of sending a sharply worded email or scheduling a pointed meeting or letting him know in any way that I had spent this particular Tuesday night pulling his financials apart with the focus of someone who had been paid very good money for a very long time to find exactly these kinds of problems. What I had was time. I had the documents. I had Janelle, and I had the practiced patience of someone who had sat across negotiating tables from very sophisticated people and waited and watched and let them believe the silence was agreement while she was actually reading the room. I was closing my portfolio folder when my email notification lit up the corner of my screen. 11:47 p.m. Declan Hartwell. Subject line, big news. Coming partner. I looked at it for a long moment without opening it. The word sat there in the subject line, cheerful and casual, the way a person uses a word when they have never had to think too carefully about what it means. Partner. I pressed my fingertips together, feeling the cool smoothness of my own rings, and thought about what it meant to be a partner in something when you had no seat at the table, no mechanism to claim one, and no warning that the person holding the majority had started making decisions in the dark. I did not open the email. I turned off the lamp and I went to think about what came next. Janelle was already at the corner table when I arrived. A cortado in front of her and a yellow legal pad angled precisely on the table's edge, her equivalent of rolling up her sleeves. She'd chosen the coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse on purpose. This was her terrain. "You look like you slept 4 hours," she said. 5. I set my bag down and signaled to the counter. I read the agreement again on the train. All 74 pages? The relevant sections. 3 times. I sat down across from her. "Janelle, I drafted tighter protections for Series A rounds in 2012 than I have in this document." She didn't say anything sympathetic, which was one of the things I valued most about her. She just uncapped her pen. "Walk me through it from the top. What do you have and what do you not have?" I ordered a flat white from the server who materialized at my elbow, and I began. I had information rights, explicit, enumerated, quarterly financials, annual audited statements, board meeting minutes within 30 days of each meeting. That was solid. I had a right to inspect the company's books and records upon written request with reasonable notice. Also solid, though the word reasonable was doing a lot of work in that clause, and Declan's attorneys would know it. I had a pro rata right to participate in future equity rounds above a certain threshold, which gave me anti-dilution protection, but only above that threshold. Below it, I was exposed. What I did not have was a supermajority voting requirement on major corporate decisions. No requirement that equity restructurings needed my consent or qualified majority. No explicit prohibition on related party transactions without independent board approval. No requirement that executive compensation changes be approved by anyone other than the board. And since the board was, in practical terms, Declan, that requirement was a closed loop. And no cumulative voting, which I already knew, which still landed like a bruise every time I thought about it. Janelle wrote as I talked. When I finished, she looked at her notes for a moment. "Okay, so here's what he can legally do with his majority position." I know what he can legally do. "Tell me anyway. I want to hear you say it." I picked up my flat white. It was good, strong and smooth, the kind of coffee that made you feel like you had a plan even when you were still building one. With 61%, he controls every board seat under straight voting. He can approve ordinary business decisions without my consent. He can vote on most corporate matters and carry them by simple majority. He can technically approve his own compensation through the board, since the board is functionally him. I set the cup down. What he cannot do, depending on how a court looks at it, is self-deal without disclosure. He cannot breach his fiduciary duty as a majority shareholder to act in the company's best interest rather than his own, and it cannot fraudulently misrepresent the company's financial condition to minority shareholders. Janelle tapped her pen against the pad. So, the compensation increase. If there's no legitimate performance milestone framework documented anywhere, if that footnote is a fiction, then he didn't just approve his own raise through a rubber stamp board process. He potentially approved a raise with no documented authorization at all, then buried it in a footnote and called it a framework. Ah, that's a breach of fiduciary duty argument, Janelle said. Possibly shareholder oppression, depending on what else you find. She said the phrase with the particular weight attorneys give to terms of art, not drama, just precision. Oppression doctrine varies by state, but the core concept is consistent. A majority shareholder who uses their control position to benefit themselves at the expense of minority shareholders in a way that defeats the minority's reasonable expectations has crossed a legal line. It's not just bad governance, it's actionable. I know. A well-drafted agreement would have included an explicit related party transaction clause. Any deal between the company and an entity affiliated with the CEO requires independent board approval, or at minimum disclosure and shareholder consent. Without that, I know. The words came out more quietly this time. Janelle looked at me over the rim of her cortado. She had known me for 19 years. She knew when to push and when to let something sit. You wrote these clauses for people, she said, not unkindly, dozens of times. I looked out the window at the street where a courier on a bicycle was threading through a gap in traffic with the casual precision of someone who trusted their own reflexes. Tag-along rights, drag-along rights, related party transaction approval requirements, supermajority thresholds on equity restructurings. I wrote them from the majority side and the minority side. I knew what they were for. I looked back at her. I let the valuation conversation crowd out the structural conversation. It was one bad day of negotiating focus, and I have apparently been paying for it since. You're paying for it now, Janelle said. The question is how you stop paying for it and start collecting. I ordered a second coffee. The pattern emerged over 4 days of obsessive analysis. I worked at home, curtains half drawn against the autumn light that made everything look warmer and more forgiving than it was. I had 6 quarters of Valoris financials, gathered from the quarterly packages I'd received as part of my information rights. I built a spreadsheet, clean, color-coded, the kind of obsessive financial mapping I used to do at Morrison Stall, when a deal had something in it that didn't add up and I needed to show a partner why. The software licensing revenue was the thread. Valoris's primary product, the workflow automation platform, was licensed to enterprise clients on annual subscription contracts. It was the company's core revenue stream. I knew the rough contours of the client list from the quarterly narratives, 11 anchor clients, a growing roster of mid-market accounts, 2 government contracts that had come in the previous year. In the first and second quarters of the current year, the licensing revenue line was lower than the growth trajectory predicted. Not dramatically, not the kind of drop that would trigger an alarm in a casual reading. But I wasn't reading casually. I was reading the way you read when you already suspect something is wrong and you're looking for where the money went. I cross-referenced against the client retention figures Declan had included in the second quarter narrative, which showed no significant churn. So the clients were there, the contracts were active, the revenue should have been flowing, but it wasn't. I went looking for Hartwell Digital Solutions on a Tuesday morning, mug of tea at my elbow, the spreadsheet open on one screen, and a corporate registry search on the other. It took me 11 minutes to find it. Hartwell Digital Solutions, LLC, registered 8 months ago in Delaware. Registered agent, a service company. Managing member, Declan R. Hartwell. I sat with that for a moment. 8 months ago. Right around the start of the first quarter, when the licensing revenue first started, running light, I went back to the financials and looked harder. There it was, in a vendor payment summary, buried in the first quarter operating expenses, a line item I'd initially read as the infrastructure cost. Digital Solutions Licensing, third party, $143,000. I found the same line in the second quarter, $147,000. $290,000 routed to an LLC that Declan owned, billed as a third-party licensing cost, reducing Valoris's net revenue and its reported profitability. The enterprise clients were probably still paying full contract value. The money was going to Valoris, flowing through to Hartwell Digital Solutions as a licensing fee and landing in Declan's pocket. I finished my tea. It had gone cold without my noticing. I titled the spreadsheet tab Revenue Architecture because I needed to call it something, and because that was exactly what it was. Not sloppiness, not a bookkeeping error, architecture. Someone had built this structure intentionally with enough sophistication to make it look like a routine vendor payment, and had then sent me quarterly financial packages that contained the evidence of it, apparently trusting that I wouldn't look closely enough. He had forgotten what I used to do for a living. I documented everything in the encrypted folder and sent Janelle a message marked urgent. Then I sat in my quiet office and felt the anger shift into something colder and more useful, the way water under pressure finds the exact shape of whatever's containing it. Declan called on a Thursday, mid-morning, the way he always called, like a man whose schedule was the sun everything else orbited. Priya, hey, how are you doing? How's the portfolio? I was standing at my kitchen window, watching a neighbor's dog investigate a paper bag with deep philosophical commitment. Good. Busy. You? Incredible, honestly. Things are moving fast over here. His voice had the particular quality it always carried when he was about to tell you something he thought you'd find exciting. A slight acceleration, a warmth that was probably genuine, but had been refined by years of pitching into something that felt more like a performance than a conversation. We've got some strategic interest I'm working through, really significant players. I think we're heading into a transformational period. That sounds promising, I said, which was true and also told him nothing. I wanted to loop you in before things get formal, because I think there are some decisions coming that could affect your position. He paused, and in the pause, I could hear him shifting into the other mode, the reasonable, practical, we're all adults here mode. One option I'm looking at is bringing in a larger strategic partner. It would mean restructuring the equity a bit, which I know sounds like a lot, but honestly, the valuation improvement would be significant. What kind of restructuring? Still working through the details, but I also want to make sure you have options, Priya. I know you've been a great supporter of what we're building, and I want to be fair to you. Another pause. I've been thinking about whether a buyout of your stake might actually be the cleanest path forward for both of us. I moved away from the window and sat down at my kitchen table. I opened my notebook to a blank page and picked up a pen. What kind of number are you thinking? 610,000. He said it the way you say, a number you've already decided is generous, which, given where the company is right now from a valuation standpoint, I think is very fair. I waited 2 seconds. I put in 850,000, Declan. I know, and I know that looks like a discount, but you have to consider the risk-adjusted position here. You've been in for 18 months. You've been fairly passive, and the market for minority stakes in private SaaS companies at this stage is extremely limited. I'll think about it, I said. 2 seconds exactly. I had counted to 2 in my head before speaking because I needed to hear the offer land and settle before I responded to it, and because I did not want him to hear anything in my voice except measured consideration. Great, that's all I'm asking. Just think about it. He sounded genuinely pleased, which told me he had heard what he wanted to hear. Honestly, Priya, it's a good deal. You're a great supporter, but this company has grown past what a passive investor can really understand. I wrote down passive investor. I underlined it twice. Then I wrote the number 610 and put a circle around it. I'll be in touch, I said. After I hung up, I sat at the table for a few minutes without moving. The dog across the street had apparently resolved whatever questions the paper bag had raised and was now trotting purposefully down the sidewalk. I watched it until it turned the corner. $610,000. He had done the math and arrived at a number that was just plausible enough to not be insulting on its face, while being exactly insulting enough to tell me precisely what he thought of my ability to fight back. A sophisticated investor, someone with resources and knowledge and access to good legal counsel, would never accept $240,000 less than their invested capital on a company that was actively, if secretly, growing. Declan knew that. He was not offering me a fair exit. He was offering me an exit he calculated I would take because I didn't know what he'd done and didn't have the firepower to find out. Passive investor. I formally retained Janelle that afternoon. The books and records request went out the next morning, drafted in language that left no ambiguity about what I was entitled to and why. Under the shareholder agreement's inspection rights clause, I requested complete financial records for the preceding 8 quarters, all board resolutions and meeting minutes, all material contracts, including any agreements between Valoris and third-party vendors, and the executive employment agreement that had supposedly established the performance milestone framework referenced in the 3rd quarter footnote. The request was sent to Declan directly, copied to the company's registered address, dated and time-stamped. Declan's response came 6 days later, not from Declan, but from an attorney named Grayson Poole at a firm I recognized. Large, aggressive, expensive. The letter was 4 pages long. It acknowledged my right to inspection under the shareholder agreement, established a process for document production that involved a third-party review for privilege, and set a production timeline of 30 business days. It was a delay tactic dressed in procedural language, and it was well executed. Poole was good. What they sent me on day 29 was 1,400 pages of PDFs. I called Janelle when the files arrived. He buried it. Of course he did. I could hear the click of her keyboard. How long do you need? Give me the weekend. I worked Friday night, all day, Saturday, most of Sunday. I had a system. I always had a system. It was one of the things Marcus Morrison had instilled in me with the particular fervor of someone who had once lost an arbitration because a junior associate had failed to read page 847 of a document production. You build your index first. You note every document, its date, its signatories, its subject. Then you work chronologically. Then you cross-reference. By Saturday afternoon, I had found the board resolutions. There were 11 of them over the preceding 8 quarters, covering decisions that should have required proper board process. Vendor contracts, executive compensation adjustments, the opening of new bank accounts, a credit facility. Every single one was signed by Declan Hartwell in his capacity as chairman of the board of directors. Not one of them showed a quorum of directors having been established, because establishing quorum would have required notifying me. As a shareholder with information rights, I was entitled to know when board meetings occurred. These resolutions hadn't been passed in meetings. They had been signed by one person at his desk whenever he needed a piece of paper that said the board had decided something. On Sunday morning, still in my bathrobe with a second pot of coffee cooling beside me, I found the agreement. The software licensing and distribution agreement between Valor Software Inc. and Hartwell Digital Solutions, LLC, dated 7 months and 3 weeks ago. 8 pages. Setting out a licensing arrangement under which Hartwell Digital Solutions would have the right to sublicense Valoris's core platform to certain channel partner clients in exchange for a fee equal to 30% of the sublicensing revenue. The clients were named in an exhibit. I recognized 3 of them from Valoris's anchor client list. At the bottom of the signature page, Declan R. Hartwell, CEO, Valoris Software Inc., and below that, on the counterparty line, Declan R. Hartwell, Managing Member, Hartwell Digital Solutions, LLC. He had signed both sides of the contract. I set my coffee down very carefully. In 15 years of corporate law, I had seen a lot of self-dealing. I had seen executives expense personal travel, founders redirect corporate opportunities, majority shareholders approve dividends that favored one class of shares. I had seen sophisticated, intelligent people convince themselves that their judgment was sufficient oversight of their own interests. But there was something almost breathtaking about watching someone sign their own name twice on a contract, once as the seller and once as the buyer, and apparently believed that no one would ever read it. He had signed both sides of a contract that moved $290,000 from the company he partly owned with me into a company he owned entirely by himself, without disclosing the conflict of interest to me, without obtaining board approval that was anything more than his own signature, and without reflecting it accurately in the financial narrative he'd sent me quarterly for 8 months. That was not a governance failure. That was textbook self-dealing, a related party transaction executed without the independent approval that even the most permissive shareholder agreements typically required, precisely because the conflict was so obvious that no reasonable drafter would leave it unchecked. I had required independent board or shareholder approval for related party transactions in every agreement I'd ever drafted for a minority investor. I had required it because of exactly this scenario, because a majority shareholder with sufficient control can, without that protection, simply decide that what's good for them is definitionally good for the company. The irony was not lost on me. I had written the protection that would have caught this. I had not negotiated it for myself. And now I was sitting in my bathrobe on a Sunday morning, having found the evidence of what that omission had cost. I documented everything, saved it to the encrypted folder, and emailed Janelle a summary with the relevant document numbers. Her reply came back in 20 minutes. Call me. I called her immediately. The dual signature, she said without preamble. Yes. That's your conflict of interest. That's the related party transaction executed without independent approval, combined with the board resolutions that were never put to an actual meeting, and the compensation increase that references a performance framework that doesn't exist in any document they produced. Right. A pause. Priya, this is a strong case. I want to be clear about that without overstating it. There are always variables in litigation. But you have a fiduciary duty breach argument, a shareholder oppression argument, and if a court looks at the licensing arrangement as intentional misdirection of revenue, you may have fraud. I absorb that. What do we do with it? For now, we keep building. We need an expert accountant to trace the full revenue flow. I have someone. And we wait for him to make the next move because from what you've described, he's not done. She paused again. Has he made any other overtures? He offered me $610,000. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He wanted you out before you found this. Yes? He miscalculated. He did, I agreed. The formal notice arrived on a Friday by email and by certified mail to my home address because the shareholder agreement required both for notices of shareholder meetings. Grayson Poole's firm again. Subject, Notice of Special Shareholder Meeting. Strategic Restructuring and Capital Transaction. I read it standing at my desk, coat still on from the walk back from the mail slot, the autumn afternoon pressing thin gold light through the window. The notice was clean and professional and delivered with the confidence of someone who was certain of their position. Declan was calling a special shareholder meeting to vote on a proposed equity issuance, new shares, to be sold to an unnamed strategic investor at a valuation and on terms to be disclosed at the meeting. The issuance would represent 43% of the post-issuance capitalization. I did the math without a calculator. Post-issuance, my 28% stake, built on $850,000 of my money, would be diluted to approximately 9%. 9% was below the threshold in my shareholder agreement that triggered my pro rata participation rights. It was below the threshold that gave me any meaningful information, rights beyond what state law minimally required. It was, in practical terms, the number that made me a rounding error on the cap table. He had designed this to erase me. The notice gave me 21 days. I read it through a second time, slowly, the way I used to read adverse documents at Morrison Stall. Not looking for where I was right, but looking for every place where he had made an error. A bad notice provision, a miscalculated threshold, a procedural defect in how the meeting was being called. I was looking for the gap in the wall. I found two. I hung my coat on the hook behind the door and sat down at my desk, the notice still in my hands. Then I called Janelle. I have the dilutive issuance notice, I said when she picked up. 21 days, he's taking me from 28% to 9%. He's finally committed. Her voice was steady and very focused, the voice she used in depositions, I suspected. How does the notice look procedurally? He has problems. I looked at the pages on my desk. But I want to talk through the oppression remedies before we decide how to move. Yes, come in Monday morning. Janelle? I picked up the notice one more time and looked at Declan's name printed at the bottom above Grayson Poole's signature block. Cheerful, confident, certain that 21 days and 1,400 pages of PDFs were enough to bury a passive investor who had gotten in his way. File the injunction Monday morning and pull everything we have on shareholder oppression remedies in this state. He just gave us our opening. Janelle filed at 9:14 Monday morning. I know the exact time because I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I wasn't drinking, watching my phone, and her text came through at 9:16. Filed. Now we wait. I didn't have to wait long. The motion for a temporary restraining order landed in front of a judge who, according to Janelle, had spent 12 years as a corporate attorney before taking the bench and had no patience for procedural games dressed up as legitimate business decisions. The TRO was granted at 2:47 that afternoon. The dilutive stock issuance was frozen. The special shareholder meeting Declan had so carefully scheduled was going nowhere. Grayson Poole called Janelle at 3:51. She texted me 2 words. He's furious. I texted back, good. I was standing at my window when Declan called, watching the tech district settle into a gray Tuesday afternoon. From my apartment, I could see the edge of the building where Valoris kept its offices, a converted warehouse with tall industrial windows and exposed brick that cost 3 times as much per square foot as conventional office space. I had been inside those offices once, 18 months ago, when I'd come to review the corporate documents before wiring the money. Declan had walked me through the open floor plan with the proprietary pride of someone who had built something real. The developers had been focused and quiet at their desks. The product roadmap on the wall was ambitious in a way that looked earned rather than aspirational. I had thought, this is a company worth believing in. He had made that harder than it needed to be. My phone buzzed. Declan Hartwell, the screen said. I let it ring once, watching his building's windows catch the flat gray light, and then I answered. Priya. No warmth in his voice, no acceleration, no performance of enthusiasm. His voice was stripped down to its frame, and what the frame showed was cold and tight with anger. You need to tell your attorney to withdraw that injunction. I don't think I'm going to do that. You have no idea what you're doing. The words came out deliberate and spaced, the way people speak when they are trying to sound controlled and aren't quite managing it. You came in with your check and your little legal background, and you think that makes you an operator? You are a footnote in this company story, Priya. A footnote with an attorney. I listened to that. I let it exist in the air between us for a moment. Sit down, he said. And now there was something almost tired in it, the tone of a man who has decided you are an inconvenience to be managed. Cash out and let the adults run the business. I let 3 seconds pass. I was looking at his building's windows, thinking about the developers in there who had built something genuinely valuable, thinking about the 11 enterprise clients and the 2 government contracts and the product roadmap that had made every other investment in that pitch room look pedestrian 18 months ago. Thinking about what Declan had decided to do was something that was worth protecting. I wrote the agreement that owns you, I said. The silence from his end was immediate and complete. I found the Hartwell Digital Solutions transfers. I continued, my voice very level and very quiet, the voice I used in depositions when I had the document in hand and wanted the witness to understand I had the document in hand. I have the board resolutions you signed alone, the meeting minutes that never reflected a proper quorum, and the licensing contract where you signed as both parties. I paused. I also have a forensic accountant who has been reviewing Valoris's books for 2 weeks. The injunction is the polite version of what comes. Next, nothing from Declan. Not even his breathing, which told me he had pulled the phone slightly away from his face. So here is what happens now, I said. You will withdraw the restructuring proposal. You will repay Valoris the $290,000 in diverted licensing revenue. And you will agree to a restructured shareholder agreement, one I draft this time, that includes cumulative voting rights, supermajority requirements for major corporate decisions, an independent director on the board, and mandatory independent approval for any related party transactions. I let that settle. Or we go to court, and everything I just told you becomes a matter of public record. You're bluffing. But it came out too quickly, too flat, and we both knew it wasn't a statement of conviction. It was a man buying himself 3 seconds to think. I'm an attorney who spent 15 years in corporate governance, Declan. I don't bluff. I document. I turned away from the window. And in case your attorney hasn't walked you through the full menu yet, let me do it for you. Under state corporate law, shareholder oppression remedies include a court-ordered buyout of my shares at fair market value, not $610,000. Fair market value determined by the court's appointed expert. They also include disgorgement of profits obtained through self-dealing. That's your $290,000 plus interest. Damages for breach of fiduciary duty, appointment of a receiver to manage company assets if the court determines the existing leadership cannot be trusted to act in all shareholders' interests. I paused. And judicial dissolution of the company, which nobody wants, including me. But it is on the table, and a court will put it there if the evidence of oppressive conduct is as clear as mine is. The silence this time was different. It had weight to it. Call Poole, I said. Tell him to call Janelle. We can do this civilly, and we can do it without making Valoris collateral damage. I looked at the window again, the gray light, his building 2 blocks away. The company is good, Declan. The product is real. I invested because I believe that. I still do. But I will not let you dismantle my position in it to cover a self-dealing scheme, and I will not sit down, and I am not a footnote. I picked up my tea. It was cold. I set it back down. Have Poole call Janelle by end of business tomorrow. I ended the call. Then I stood in my kitchen in the gray afternoon quiet and let myself feel for exactly 1 minute the full weight of the past 3 weeks. The Tuesday night with the Q3 financials. The cold tea and the jasmine candle burned to nothing. The long weekend with 1,400 pages of PDFs. The Sunday morning in my bathrobe with Declan's dual signature in front of me. The 4 days of spreadsheet work and sick architectural clarity of what I'd found. The phone call where he'd offered me $610,000 and called me a great supporter. 1 minute. Then I rinsed my cup, put it in the drying rack, and called Janelle. He'll call Poole by tomorrow, I said. You sound sure. He heard the dissolution remedy, I said. Nobody wants to hear that one. Janelle made a sound that was almost a laugh. It's the nuclear option. It's the option that tells him I'm prepared to burn the whole thing down to get what's right, which I'm not. I'd rather save the company. But he doesn't need to know my preference. He needs to know my capability. I'll have my phone with me, Janelle said. Poole called at 4:20 the following afternoon. The mediation took 10 days, which was fast by any measure, and reflected the particular urgency that attaches to a case where the evidence of self-dealing is documented, dual-signed, and in the hands of a forensic accountant who had already produced a preliminary report that Janelle had shared with Poole in enough detail to make the litigation risk very concrete. Declan's team tried twice to reframe the licensing arrangement as a legitimate channel partnership that had simply lacked proper documentation. Our forensic accountant's report made that argument difficult to sustain with a straight face. They stopped trying on day 4. What Declan agreed to in a settlement that Janelle described as clean and comprehensive was straightforward. The restructuring proposal was withdrawn. Hartwell Digital Solutions, LLC, would be dissolved within 60 days, and $290,000 plus 6% interest would be repaid to Valoris's operating accounts within 30 days of the settlement's execution. The board resolutions executed without proper quorum would be ratified by a proper board process or voided. And Declan would negotiate in good faith on a restructured shareholder agreement. That last phrase was the one I had insisted on, because I had seen what bad faith looked like in a negotiation, and I wanted the language in the agreement so that a court would have something to point to if he tried it again. I drafted the new shareholder agreement myself. 94 pages. Every clause deliberate, every defined term load-bearing, every cross-reference checked and checked again. I drafted it at the same desk where I'd first seen the Q3 financials, in the same lamplight, with the same framed photo of Morrison Stahl's founding partners behind me on the shelf. Marcus Morrison's expression in that photograph had never changed, but I understood it better now than I had at 28, sitting in his conference room, learning how to read a document that was trying to hide something from me. The protections I built into the new agreement were the ones I should have negotiated 18 months ago and had traded away for a valuation number that felt, in the moment, like a win. Cumulative voting rights. My 28% stake, concentrated, could now place a director on the board. Supermajority thresholds, 75% of shareholders, for any new equity issuance, any material asset sale, any merger or acquisition, any related party transaction above a de minimis threshold. An independent director seat filled by a candidate I had the right to propose. Mandatory board approval, including that independent director's affirmative vote for any executive compensation change above 10%. And a related party transaction clause that required disclosure, independent legal review, and shareholder notification before a single dollar could flow between Valoris and any entity affiliated with Declan or any other officer or director. The clause that protected against what Hartwell Digital Solutions had been was 17 lines long. I wrote every one of them from memory because I had written them before for other people, and I had simply forgotten, in the optimism of a champagne-soaked signing day, to write them for myself. Janelle reviewed the draft and sent it back with 11 comments, 9 of which were stylistic and 2 of which made the document stronger. We sent it to Poole. His team came back with 23 proposed revisions. We accepted 4 of them. We executed on a Thursday morning in a conference room at Janelle's firm with a court reporter present because I wanted every word of the signing process on record. Declan signed without ceremony. He had the look of a man who had recently discovered the precise outer edge of his own cleverness. I signed last. Blue ink, same as always. I did not feel like opening champagne. The independent director I proposed was Cassandra Obi. She had been chief financial officer of 2 SaaS companies that had successfully navigated acquisitions, had served on 3 boards, and had a reputation for financial governance that people in the industry described with a specific respect reserved for someone who had caught problems before they became disasters. had known her for 6 years, had nearly co-invested with her twice, and trusted her judgment the way you trust someone's judgment when you have watched them work under pressure. Cassandra's first act as an independent director was to request a full financial audit for the preceding 12 months. Her second act was to propose a conflicts of interest disclosure policy for all officers and directors, which the board passed 3-0. Declan voted yes. He had, by this point, developed what I could only describe as a newly acquired appreciation for proper governance. 6 months passed. The audit came back clean on the current period. Hartwell Digital Solutions was dissolved. The diverted revenue was back in Valoris's accounts. The financial statements reflected actual revenue from actual clients at actual contracted rates. Cassandra and I worked with Declan's head of finance to rebuild the reporting structure so that the quarterly packages I received told a coherent and accurate story about the company's performance. The company's performance, as it turned out, was good. The product was still real, the clients were still there, the pipeline was growing. When the executive compensation structure was normalized, Declan's salary, set by the board at a market rate that was well compensated, but not architecturally designed to drain the company, the profitability picture improved considerably. The acquirer came in on a Tuesday, which apparently was becoming my day for significant financial news. A strategic buyer, a larger enterprise software platform looking to expand into the mid-market professional services vertical. They had been watching Valoris for 18 months, they said. They liked the product, the client retention, the contract structure. They made an offer. Janelle called me when she saw the term sheet. Priya, you're 28%. Tell me. At their proposed valuation, she said, and I could hear the particular quality in her voice, not excitement. She was too careful for excitement, but a kind of precise satisfaction. Your stake is worth $1.4 million. I was at my desk. The lamplight was warm. Outside, the city was doing whatever the city does on a Tuesday afternoon, indifferent and continuous. I looked at the framed photograph of Morrison Stahl's 4 founding partners and thought about what Marcus used to say about the best protection in any agreement being the protection you negotiated before you needed it. $1.4 million. Against the $850,000 I had invested, against the $610,000 Declan had offered me with such cheerful condescension, against the 9% stake I would have been left with if the injunction had been filed one day later. I'll review the term sheet tonight, I said. The first board meeting under the new shareholder agreement was held on a Wednesday morning in the Valoris conference room with the tall industrial windows. The converted warehouse light was better than I remembered, warmer, the October sun coming through at an angle that made the exposed brick look like something intentional rather than just expensive. I arrived 5 minutes early, which I always do. Cassandra was already there, at her customary seat to the right of the head of the table, a tidy stack of materials in front of her, and a coffee that looked like it had been there long enough to be exactly the temperature she wanted. We exchanged a nod that contained, in the compressed way of people who understand each other's professional shorthand, approximately 300 words of mutual respect. Declan arrived at the exact minute of the call time. He took his seat at the head of the table, opened his folder, and said good morning in a voice that was professional and appropriate and entirely stripped of the particular performative warmth that had once made him the most compelling person in every pitch room he entered. He was still smart. He was still technically brilliant. He was just Now, someone who operated within a structure that required his decisions to be documented, voted on, and signed by more than one person. I could work with that. I opened my own folder. On top of the new shareholder agreement, 94 pages, every clause deliberate, the cumulative voting provision on page 28, where I could find it in the dark, I had placed a single index card. 3 words, in my own handwriting, in the blue ink I always used. Cumulative, agreement, remedies, not a reminder. I didn't need a reminder. I had spent 15 years writing these tools into agreements for other people, and I had spent the past 6 months being reminded at close range and significant expense exactly what they were for. It was something else, a record. A private acknowledgement of the specific, costly, ultimately recoverable mistake of trusting that someone else had protected what I should have protected for myself, of letting one good valuation number crowd out 15 years of structural knowledge, of signing a document I had read and still not fully seen. I had seen it now. I folded the card, slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket, and looked around the table at Cassandra's composed attention, at Declan's careful neutrality, at the legal pads and the coffee cups, and the October light on the brick wall. "Let's begin," I said. The minutes would be accurate. The votes would be recorded. Every resolution would be signed by a proper quorum. Every related party question would go to independent review, and the next quarterly package I received would tell me the true financial story of a company I had invested in because I believed in what it could become. I still believed that. I had just learned at a price I would not pay twice that belief without structure is not an investment strategy. It is hope. And hope, however genuine, does not protect your 28%. Structure does. Knowledge does. And knowing exactly what you're entitled to fight for and exactly how to fight for it, that does. I picked up my pen and called the meeting to order.